What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video, and today's we're doing something a little bit different. We are going to be diving into some historic decks that I find to be pretty decent decks for a person on a budget who maybe just get into historic for the first time, maybe just looking to take a little break from the current standard meta as a whole and looking to expand and looking to play some more Magic in general. These decks overall are fairly on the cheap. If you do play a lot of standard, there's a good chance you may have some of the rares that maybe some of these decks do have. I think at the end of the day, I think most of the decks don't have more than like maybe 10 rares. Like I said, a lot of them are staples you may already own in current standard meta, as well as I do have a few things in each deck to kind of give you like sideboard options. So if there's things that you're possibly looking forward to maybe have in place as you kind of build up more to the rares and stuff like that. If you haven't really played much historic is essentially the type of Magic in current MTG Arena that essentially uses all the sets of Magic that are currently out in MTG Arena that you can possibly buy cards from. So we have anything from the first set and all the way to the newest releases, which is Kaladesh. But pretty much everything is legal, and generally the ban list kind of follows the same suit as the current ban list in standard, as well as a couple extra cards as things have rotated out and they have now kind of like are only on the banned and historic list. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely means a lot to me. If you are new to the channel and want to know when I post more videos, hit that subscribe button. It'll let you get notified when I post new videos on the channel. But with that being said, let's dive into the first deck and let's talk about it. Alright, so the first deck on the list is actually a fairly simple one. It's fairly comparable to the one you may see in current standard, and that is a mono white Lifegain. The thing that is a little bit different here, there are some cards that are now rotated out of current standard meta that we kind of utilize in this deck to kind of give us a little bit of an edge, and on the budget it's actually a fairly strong deck. With that being said, this deck kind of works, like I said, as the current Lifegain deck in standard meta, but there's a few key cards that you may not see just because they're not standard legal. First card up is actually going to be the Ajani Pridemate. When this card was out and you played a mono white Lifegain style deck, you know, post pre-rotation, this card was definitely a menace, especially when it started really getting some +1/+1 counters on it and this thing became very massive. Only downfall with mono white is essentially there's no real way to give these cards trample, so essentially you get a very big cat and they either have to spot removal it or wipe the board as a whole. So this is one of those cards that will definitely, you know, get a pain on our opponent's life total if they really don't have any answer for it. Next card up that actually helps us build our life total and actually gain a lot of life is actually a card called Healer's Hawk. If this is a card you haven't seen before, it's a 1 mana 1/1. It doesn't seem super impressive, but it's flying lifelink, and a lot of cards you know, in Magic that a lot of people play in the aggressive decks really don't have reach unless they have flying themselves, and essentially this is a way to get that 1 point of 1 point of life to gain, you know, the additional benefits of cards that take benefit from gaining +1/+1 counters from lifelink. So this is one of those cards. With it being a common, it is on the cheap and it's a fairly strong card. Another interesting card is Leonine Vanguard. It's a card from M19. At the beginning of our combat in our turn, if we control 3 more creatures, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and we gain a life, essentially now triggering another life gain total of like our Pridemate, giving another +1/+1 counter before attacks, because it happens at the beginning of combat. We're also using Hallowed Priest, which is another card that came out from the starter decks in MTG Arena. I think this kind of follows the same suit. I think these cards are legal in the best of ones, but I don't think you can use them in traditional style. But this is another card that will also gain +1/+1 counters, and like I said, there's a lot of ways for us to gain life. Soul Warden is another 1 mana card. It's whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we gain a life. So it's not just our creatures, it's any creature. So whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we will gain a life. And if our opponent's also playing aggro, we're going to gain a lot of life, and we're going to get our creatures much bigger. Another interesting card here to make a lot of our things even better is actually Unbreakable Formation. Essentially what this does is creatures we control gain indestructible and a turn, and we can use this at instant speed. So if our opponent decides to try to play some sort of board removal by Wrath of Godin or something like that that would essentially, you know, destroy all creatures on the battlefield, we can play this and this will actually make all our creatures indestructible. The other thing that we can do is if we have an opportunity of an attack, we can actually play this during our main phase, which essentially this does is puts +1/+1 counter on all our creatures, which makes them that much stronger, and they also get vigilance on the turn. So essentially we can attack in as a free attack. Everything's indestructible, so if we have a very large board and we're much wider than our opponent, all these creatures now have vigilance. They don't tap to attack, they're also indestructible, and they're also 1 point of damage stronger. So essentially it's like one of those like final sweep moves that can catch our opponent off guard if they're not prepared for it. Definitely a very strong card in essence, especially to kind of wipe our opponent out, as well as there's other cards in the deck that are also fairly good. With it being you know, more on the aggro side, it is a fairly cheap deck. There's not really anything that's super expensive, so we don't play a lot of lands. There's only 21 lands in the deck as a whole. We also play the Shajari Shelter here as well, which could also be additional 2 lands if you want to play that as a land, but it also gives protection to a color. We have the Bugler, which allows us to look for a creature card with a power 2 or less from the top 4 of our library, put it into our hand, put the rest in the bottom of our library in any order. And there's some of the, you know, the typical suspects you see in most Lifegain decks in current standard, like the Daxos, which is a very strong card because of the, when it comes in the battlefield and or dies, it, you know, gets the additional 1 life both ways. And Conclave Tribunal is another interesting card as kind of like a spot removal for the deck, because white doesn't really have any good spot removal outside of Giant Killer, which is only good for big things. This actually can just, you know, kind of, you know, remove something from the battlefield up until this leaves the battlefield, and has this ability called Convoke, which means you can tap creatures to make this spell cost 1 less. So essentially, if our creatures have vigilance, we can also then tap them down after they attack, and then we can play this for 1 mana or all the way down to 1 mana essentially, because we make it cost 3 less by tapping 3 creatures. We got Shelter Dunes, which is a card from Amonkhet, which we can sacrifice this, and allows us to kind of give all our creatures +1/+1 in a turn, and we can activate this anytime we cast a sorcery. So if we don't have an Unbreakable formation, we can always play the Dunes to kind of allow us there. All right, now moving on to the sideboard, which is actually cards that you can use to upgrade the deck to actually make it overall stronger. So this sideboard is pretty straightforward of very strong cards that are just as good. We also have Sarah's Ascendant, which is a 1 mana 1/1. It has lifelink. As long as we have 30 or more life, it gets +5/+5 and has flying, so it becomes a 5/5 or 6/6 flyer with lifelink, which can be very good and definitely can end games. We got Helios Uncrowned. It's another strong card if you haven't played mono white before. This is a card that is like one of those essential key cards that when you start really building the rares for a mono white deck, this is the one you want to have, because every time we gain a point of life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter target creature or enchantment we control. Because it's an enchantment, I guess essentially we can target this, and we can also tap 2 mana. We can give a creature who may not have lifelink in time to turn, so essentially we can give ourselves a way to gain some life. And if we get to the overall devotion of 5, we can actually make it a 5/5 indestructible creature. So essentially it's a very good strong trump blocker that actually won't die unless our opponent, you know, gets our devotion less than 5. Ajani's Strength of the Pride is a planeswalker for M20. It allows us to gain life equal to the creatures we control plus the number of planeswalkers we control. We then also can -2, we can create a 2/2 white cat token, as you can see there. Essentially it's just a copy of Ajani's Pride Mate. It just allows us to play additional copies essentially by just playing the Pride. And then we can also 0 if we have 50 more life than our starting life total. So if we're at 35 life, we can actually have it and each I don't know, I'm losing words here, but essentially we can pay 0, we can exile Ajani's Strength of the Pride, and each artifact and creature our opponents control. So it's essentially our opponent's only sideboard wipe. So essentially this is like a way to kind of get to that ultimate finish, have a good way to get through the finish line and actually finish off our opponent there. We can also splash in some Amiria's Calls, which is another strong card from Zendikar Horizon, which is actually pretty cool to see make an appearance here. It's a 7 mana sorcery spell that if you haven't played it before, it creates 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying. Non-angel creatures we control gain indestructible in a turn, or we can play it into play as a tap land, or pay 3 life to play it untapped. So essentially it's a good way to kind of have a solid end game, another way to kind of get through, you know, if we haven't drawn the Unbreakable formation. So definitely good there. And because I couldn't fit, you know, all the Castle Arden Vales, because you can only cap at 15, I would essentially play 2 Castle Arden Vales and just battlefield tap and let's control planes. We can tap for white mana, or we can tap 4 mana and create 1 white human tokens, essentially allowing us to kind of gain more board advantage and get wider on our opponent. Essentially we just replace the Dunes with that, and then the other cards you would kind of filter in with some of the weaker cards here. I would say you probably put the Setter Attendants for maybe the Healer's Hawk, just because maybe those are better. You know, Helios Uncrowned, maybe you get rid of some, you probably get rid of your Buglers because it's a 3-drop. Ajani here, you probably kind of, you know, get rid of one of this, one of that. And then the Amiria's Call, you probably get rid of some planes and maybe the Synergy Shelters or something like that. But essentially you can kind of figure out ways to kind of allow these cards to kind of filter in here to kind of build the deck up as you get the rare wild cards to kind of add more things to the deck. The next deck up we have here is actually mono blue tempo. If you don't know what a tempo deck is, essentially what we're trying to do here is just be very tempo active, drawing cards, you know, playing things on curve, being very efficient of our mana. A lot of things we do in our tempo deck is actually in response to, so a lot of things we are responding because a lot of things in our deck have flash. We're playing some counter spells to kind of slow down our opponent from actually playing anything on the battlefield, as well as taking advantage of that. So essentially the way the deck works is we're going to play some creatures out on the battlefield, either with flash or, you know, at normal speed. I think we only have one card on the deck that actually is at normal speed, which is the Siren Storm Tamer. It's just a 1-mana 1/1 that we can use. It has flying, and we can sacrifice it, and we can counter target spell or ability that targets the creature we control. So essentially it's a card that has a built-in counter spell that, you know, allows us to counter things that target us and our creatures. But mostly everything else has flash, like the Sailor. We have Brineborn Cutthroat, you know, the Sea Dasher Octopus, you know, Brazen Borrowers. Essentially, and the Salamander actually doesn't have flash either. But in the late game, when we have a lot of spells in our graveyard, this actually becomes a nuisance for our opponent. But the way we also create tempo as we're playing things is that we have cards in the deck that essentially allow us to draw cards every time we deal damage to our opponent. So we have things like Curiosity, which is a 1-mana enchantment. Enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So if we play it on one of our little 1/1 drops, we can, every time we attack with it, we can draw a card, essentially giving us, you know, a refill in our hand, essentially, you know, giving us maybe that one counter we need or something like that. We have Curious Obsession, which is essentially the same thing. Enchanted creature is +1/+1, so it gets it a little bit stronger, and then when an enchanted creature deals damage to a player, you may draw a card. The only thing, the downfall with this is if we didn't attack with a creature, we would actually have to sacrifice Curious Obsession, which is the only downfall to it. But essentially we're in tempo, so we're trying to attack every single turn to kind of draw as many cards as possible. You know, you really utilizing the Curious Obsession there. Another card that we have in the deck that helps our creatures is we actually have the Sea Dasher Octopus. So essentially it's a flash mutate. If you haven't played Mutate before, this is actually one of the cool cards in Mutate. It's a 2-mana mutator. Whenever this creature just combat damage to a player, we draw a card, so we play at flash speed. So if they don't block, we can flash it in, give it, you know, mutate, and essentially now draw a card when it deals that damage. Brineborn Cutthroat is another interesting card in the deck because we're playing a lot of things in response or at tempo. Whenever we cast a spell during an opponent's turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Brineborn Cutthroat, not included in itself. So the turn it comes in, it doesn't actually get +1/+1. But you know, if we have to play a counter spell or anything like that, we can actually make it that much stronger. Though essentially you want to put the enchantments on the things that are in the air. We also play Brazen Borrowers for some bounce effect, and also a 3/1 flash flyer that we can also get in on our opponent without them expecting. And then we also have this Spectral Sailor, which is here in the deck that allows us to tap 4 mana. If we're getting to the end game where we don't really have a draw engine, we can actually tap 4 mana to draw a card to hopefully get what we want. Castle Rancher just for the scry. And we have a bunch of counter spells of various things. We have Essence Capture for the creatures. We got Substantiate for 2 mana. We have, you know, some Lookout Dispersals because we play the pirates here. Also Pirate and Pirate as well. We have Lofty Denials because a lot of our things in our deck have flying. We got Ops for some, you know, some draws from draw actions, some Spell Pierce to kind of slow down our opponents if they're playing something more spell based. And we have some cards in the deck just in case, you know, in our sideboard, just in case there's certain cards you don't have. You know, I have additional copies of Brineborn Cutthroat. Maybe you don't have all the Sea Dasher Octopuses. You know, I got some Merfolk Tricksters in case, you know, maybe not have all of the Brazen Borrowers. You know, additional counter spells, dispersals, and possibly an island if you don't have, you know, actually the one Castle Vantress. You know, you can play one island, you know, eventually you can then maybe get the one Castle Vantress when you do have it. I would say the Castle Vantress is probably not, you know, the main priority. I would actually say it's probably getting like these guys here, the Brazen Borrower and the Sea Dasher Octopus, just because those decks help the tempo of the deck. The Castle Vantress will kind of help the end game, but you know, you can still win with this deck without it because you'll have a lot of things to draw, and you know, it's really a very big mana sink if you don't have the mana to sink into it to really get the scry effect. Now the next deck is kind of like the prior one, but this one's a little bit different, and that is Azorius Enchantments. This one's actually pretty interesting because we are playing enchantments to just make our creatures stronger. Sure, we play cards that will make our creatures overall help us draw cards, but what we're trying to do here is kind of like make one creature really just a very large creature, and that creature actually is the Core Spirit Dancer, which is like the key card in the deck. Essentially what this card does, if you're not reading it right now, it gives a +2/+2 and for each aura attached to it, and whenever we cast an aura spell we may draw a card. So instead of us having to deal damage to a creature to draw a card, every time we now cast an aura spell we draw a card. And the other thing too, because we also are splash on white in the deck, is we're actually making this a Lurrus deck. So essentially Lurrus is our companion, and we can now play things that have a mana cost of 2 or less from our graveyard once a turn, as long as Lurrus is on the battlefield. So essentially if they remove something of ours, and with us being everything less than 2, we can actually get it back with the Lurrus on the battlefield. So the way we do this one differently, we actually play something called Ornithopter. If you're not familiar, it's an artifact creature that costs 0 mana. It's a 0/2. Nothing impressive off the bat, but it costs 0 mana, so it's a 0/2 blocker, and then eventually it's now a bigger creature flyer that will essentially get benefits of various enchantments in our deck. We got Alice's Life Bounty for the protection to give either our Lurrus or even our one creature who has all the enchantments on it protection. Also itself is a life linker, so if we do attack in with it, we actually gain life out of it. Healer's Hawk has another up in the air life linker that will gain us life. Essentially this can also be a creature that we can target with our enchantments to make it that much stronger, allowing us to gain more life and hopefully finish our opponent off quicker. Selfless Savior for the indestructible ability. We got Sentinel's Eyes for the replayability, giving our creature +1/+1 and vigilance, and the cheap escape cost, which is fairly good. We got Arcane Flight, which gives our creature now flying for 1 mana if it doesn't have flying already, and +1/+1. Curious Obsession, like I said before in the prior deck, it actually is another good card for the deck just because it gives it +1/+1, and whenever it deals combat damage, we now draw a card. We got the Aldonto Vanguard, definitely a good card. It may not look impressive because it's a 2 mana 1/1er, but as long as it's attacking, it gets +2/+0, and we can actually pay for life and give it indestructible in a turn. So just in case they may have a spot removal, we can actually pay for, give it indestructible, and then essentially, you know, they have to either try to kill it again before it goes into effect, or, you know, take the damage that this is going to do. All That Glitters is actually like the card that brings this all together, because this card gives us +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment we control. So our auras are enchantments, so how many enchantments plus this one will give whatever creature +1/+1 for each one of them. Of course, Spirit Dancer, the lifeblood of the deck. We got Aether Tunnel, which gives the target creature +1/+0 and can't be blocked, so now our creature's unblockable. So essentially if we get a very big creature, now this creature's unblockable and our opponent now has to actually spot removal it, or they're just going to die eventually from the big damage. And we got Staggering Insight because we're splashed in the blue and white. Essentially it's a +1/+1 lifelink, and whenever this creature does combat damage to a player, draw a card. And then the mana base overall is a little bit of a mixture. Some cast on Arveils if we need to make more tokens, if we're not really drawing much into our creature department. You know, a mixture of plains and islands. Glacial Fortress, which is actually one of these check lands that if we have an island or plains, it comes into play untapped and creates blue or white mana. Hallowed Fountains, which is a pay 2 life shock land, comes in battlefield tap, creates blue and white. And Temple Ardenvale, or not Temple Ardenvale, Temple of Enlightenment. Ardenvale is I think the red and green one. It comes in the battlefield, we can scry. Very good in general. In the sideboard I have some cards that if you don't have the rares, you can actually replace some things. So essentially what it is really just the mana base. If you just want to replace the mana base, because the key card you really need in the deck to make this really work is the core Spirit Dancer. The Lurrus is definitely a benefit, but if you play standard you may already have a copy. The core Spirit Dancer is really the card that it's the meat and potatoes of the deck to overall make this deck really be that efficient. So essentially if you don't have the lands, you can always replace, you know, 3 plains, 3 islands, and 4 tranquil coves, and kind of take out, you know, the cards here and kind of build into these cards. Essentially I would say probably get in like the glacial fortresses and the hollow fountains first. Temples aren't as important. I don't really think temples are a great card. It's a decent card, but it's always terrible when a card comes in the battlefield tapped. So I would actually say these 2 lands are more important. Also, if you want to, you know, also slowly build into Castle Ardenvale, I just say add 2 additional planes to the list, which I'll actually do right now. So there's 5 planes, which count for those 2. But like I said, the lands are not as important as the core Spirit Dancer, so you have to kind of need the core Spirit Dancer to kind of build into that until you can actually, you know, work on the lands. But that being said, this is actually a fairly effective deck, especially if your opponent has no way to really stop it. So this next deck up on the list is actually a fairly interesting one. This one's actually pretty much a pure either Kaladesh style deck. I don't know why I was saying either Revolt. Either Revolt I think is one of the sets that some of the cards are from, but it's from the Kaladesh set. Essentially a lot of the things in this deck actually revolve around the energy ability that kind of came with Kaladesh. If you don't know what energy is, it's a little thing, it's a little symbol, as you kind of can't see because I'm blocking it, I just realized. Essentially, a lot of the cards have enters the battlefield, you gain 2 energy. Whenever it attacks, you may pay an energy. It gets +1/+1 against trample. So essentially, a lot of the cards in our deck are going to take advantage of this, or create energy in a way for us to take advantage of. You know, we got things like you know, this Attune with Aether allows us to search for a basic land card, reveal it to put our hand, and shuffle our library, and we get 2 energy. So it's actually fairly strong in that sense. Because we play cards like this, which is a 2 mana instant speed burn spell that we get to choose target creature. We get 3 energy, so essentially we get 3 energy for 2 mana, and then we can actually pay any amount of energy we have, and Harness Lightning deals that much damage and the amount of energy we paid to that creature. So essentially it could at least be a 2 mana 3 damage target creature spell for instant speed, which is fairly strong. And then we just play a bunch of other things, like I said, that gain energy or take advantage of energy. This one's actually fairly good. Whenever it deals combat damage to player, we get 2 energy, and then we can pay 2 energy and give it a +1/+1 counter for 2 mana. It makes it very good. So essentially it can actually already be a 3/3 if we want to pay the additional mana. Servant of the Conduit, it's actually another interesting card. We get to pay 1 energy, make 1 mana of any color. Burning Tree Emissary is a very strong card if you're playing any sort of Gruul in Historic. You want to play this card just because it's a 2 mana 2/2er. It actually replaces the mana it uses to play the card. So if you have 2 plays in the same turn, you play this and play the other 2 mana cost, you're gonna get 2 cards for the price of 1. Voltic Brawler is another card, like I said in the beginning. It's a card that creates energy, and then whenever it attacks, we pay an energy. If we do, it gets +1/+1 and trample. And this is actually the interesting card of the deck. It doesn't look as impressive right off the bat, but it's this card right here. It's Electrostatic Pummeler. Essentially, it's a 3 mana 1/1. If you don't know what it does, it actually enters the battlefield. We get 3 energy. What we can do with that 3 energy is we can pay 3 energy. It gets +X/+X, where X is its power. You may have noticed there's some cards in the deck that actually that will actually pump up your creature. So you have Colossus, which is a 2 mana, it gives target creature +2 or +4/+2 and gains trample. We also have built into Smash, which is a 1 mana instant, gives +3/+3. If it's an artifact creature, it gains trample until end of turn. And we also have Blossom in Defense, which is a 1 mana instant speed, target creature gains +2/+2 and hexproof till end of turn. So essentially what you want to do is kind of pump up this guy, pay the 3 energy. You're gonna then make it, you know, let's just say you put this on its +4/+2. It's now a 5/3. You pay the 3 energy, now it becomes, and it gains an additional +X/+X, where X is its power. So now it gains an additional +5/+5. So essentially becomes a 10/10, or 10/8 for 3 energy, and it has trample. So now you're swinging in for 10 trampling damage. Combine that with any of these other cards, you know, +3/+3 or even +2/+2. This card becomes very troublesome for our opponent to deal with, especially we are drawn into a lot of our energy or creating a lot of energy. This thing can definitely be a card that's definitely going to finish off your opponent fairly quickly. A couple other cards I have in the deck if you really want to kind of either mitigate or kind of like cheapen the deck a little bit are the lands, because this plays a lot of like the Stomping Grounds, the Pathways. You can play the Gruul Guildgate. Guildgates are pretty good dual lands if you want to play additional like dual lands if you don't have all the lands there. Another one is the Rugged Highlands there, which can also replace the Stomping Grounds or the Pathways. Another interesting one, which I'm actually fairly surprised from why I didn't think of it, is also the Rubicon Crag. It's something you can play if you don't want to play the Pathways or don't want to play the Stomping Grounds. It's actually a land that checks if you have the mountains or forest. I would actually essentially probably play these over the Pathways, just because it allows you to create, you know, green or red. So there's that, and then, you know, get the Embercleave. I you know, it's one of those things that it may not be as good in this deck just because this card really takes advantage of it being as high as possible, whereas Embercleave only gives it +1/+1 and trample and double strike. It could be a very good card in this deck because there's a lot of cards in the deck that could actually take advantage of it. Maybe tune down, let's just say, you know, 1 built to Smash and possibly 1 Blossom in Defense and play 2 copies of Embercleave in the deck. It's a possibility. I don't really know. It's something maybe to experiment with, but I think Embercleave is also a card that could really see play in this deck just because it automatically gives something double strike and trample. Seems to be pretty good. So overall pretty good there. And we also play the land here, which I'm actually blocking, but essentially it comes into battlefield, we get an energy, we get to play, you can make colorless or you can pay an energy, you can make 1 mana of any color. It's just another way to kind of create additional energy on our side of the battlefield. And with it being new Kaladesh cards, it's definitely a fun deck to, you know, utilize the new Kaladesh cards that have entered into MTG Historic. So the next deck up is we have Rakdos Arcanist, which is a deck that plays Rakdos mana and actually plays Dreadhorde Arcanist, which came out of War of the Spark. And essentially it's a 1/3, doesn't look too impressive, but whenever it attacks, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with convert mana cost less than to equal to the power of Dreadhorde Arcanist from the graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell be put into our graveyard instead, it now is exiled. So essentially what this card does, we swing in with it. If it's a 1/3 still, we're going to be able to replay any card, any spell from our graveyard that cost 1. So essentially we can now target any of our instants and sorceries. So we have things like Spark Harvest as additional cost, destroy target creature or planeswalker. We have things like Thoughtseize, Village Rites, claim the Forestborn, Spikefield Hazard. If we can get it stronger, we can always play Argrass Rampage, which essentially we don't really have any real way to actually make it overall stronger. It's just a possibility if it was added to. But essentially we're going to play a lot of these 1-drops. We also have a card called Claim, which essentially now allows us to return target creature with converted mana cost 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. So we can either get back another Arcanist. We play a card called Young Pyromancer that whenever we cast an instant or a sorcery spell, we get a 1/1 elemental token. So if one of these end up in the graveyard, we can always get that back. We can get back a Stitcher Supply, which is a card that mills us from our graveyard to the battlefield. And whenever it dies, it also mills us 3 cards. So it's a good way to fill up our graveyard. Archfiend Vessel is another strong card here with Claim. Essentially now we get the free 5/5 with that ability. We play Lurrus as well as our Companion just because it's a very cheap deck in the sense that we don't really play anything expensive. This is actually, I think, one of the cheaper decks of the overall thing. I mean, sure, maybe the Thoughtseizes are a little bit on the higher end with wild cards and also the Dreadhorde Arcanist, but there's other cards you could probably play outside the Thoughtseize if you really want to play. There's like the 2-mana card. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but I know it's 2 mana, and you can, look at the target player's hand. You non-land card, you get to, have them exile instead of paying its mana cost, and I think you lose a life. But it costs 1 additional mana, so you wouldn't be able to replay it with the Arcanist, but this is why it's that much better. And then in our sideboard, we have some cards that you can definitely, add into the deck to make it overall better. You have things like Kroxa, which essentially, if you can get that back from the graveyard with either Lurrus or Claim, and just keep on repeating it in that sense, and then the end game you kind of get up to the 4 mana to bring it back. It's very, very strong. The Devil's a strong spot removal spell that you can definitely add into the deck. Shatter and Smashing and Academia's Wake are definitely good cards in their own right, just because they play lands or as played as their actual cards themselves and play them for their ability. Blood Crypt, Dragon Skull Summit, and Fabled Passage are some other good cards that actually round out this. You can essentially play a set of each, remove in like the Bloodfell Caves and Swamps and Mountains to kind of balance there. Same thing with Shadowskull Smashing and Dignity's Wake. You kind of remove some of the lands in order to play those. Bedevil, if you want to kind of play this, and maybe instead of some like the Spark Harvester is probably a good thing there, so you don't have to sacrifice a creature. And of course Kroxa, you just kind of maybe replace it with some Young Pyromancers, or maybe like you get rid of like a couple of Stitcher Suppliers, or even Archfiend Vessel, go down to 2, and then maybe go down to 2 here, and then just maybe get rid of 2 of these, or just get rid of all the Young Pyromancers, depending on how you feel. But overall, I mean, this is a good deck that definitely is fairly strong and fairly competitive, even in this form. It is a little bit on the pricier side, being at 8 rares, but I think these are definitely good decks to get you started. Each one brings a different element to the table. Each brings something a little unique, especially if you want to try to test out the waters in Historic. And each are fairly competitive that should do fairly well when you do play them. I mean, it is a different meta in Historic, so it is something to get used to when you first start playing. But guys, let me know what you guys think about the decks down in the comments below, which ones you like the most, which one, it's something you may try out. If you guys like the video, hit that like button. Definitely lets me know that you guys kind of like want these videos on the channel. If you're new here and you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button. You'll get notified when I post new videos, and I'll see you in the next video.